The city of Los Angeles was silent that night, wrapped in the kind of heavy rain that made the streets glisten like dark glass. Keanu Reeves sat alone in his dim living room, the sound of rain echoing softly against the wide windows. His phone buzzed once, then again, its vibration breaking the quiet rhythm of the storm. When he looked at the screen, the name made his heart stop for a second. It was Sandra Bullock. He had not spoken to her for months. They had both been busy with their own lives, their own paths, but there was something about their friendship that never faded. Even silence between them carried warmth. But tonight, her name flashing on the screen felt different. Something in his chest told him this call was not casual. He answered softly, "Sandra, are you okay?" For a moment, there was no answer, only the muffled sound of breathing. Then her voice came, trembling, fragile, as if the words themselves were breaking. "Keanu, something happened." He stood up instantly, his pulse quickening. "What happened?" "Where are you?" She tried to speak again, but her voice cracked. "It's gone. Everything from her. All of it. It's gone." Her words made no sense at first, but her tone was heavy with pain, the kind that comes only from losing something you can never replace. "Sandra, slow down," he said gently, trying to keep her calm. "Tell me what's gone." But before she could answer, the line went silent. A faint static replaced her voice. He called back again and again, but there was no reply. The rain outside grew stronger, tapping harder against the glass as if echoing his heartbeat. He stood still for a few seconds, then moved. There was no hesitation in his body. He grabbed his jacket, his car keys, and stepped out into the storm. He didn't know exactly what had happened or where the night would take him. He only knew one thing. She needed him. As he drove through the slick streets, the wipers struggled to clear the windshield. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of her words. Everything from her. Who was she talking about? Then it hit him. Sandra's mother, the woman she often spoke about with such deep love. Sandra had lost her years ago, but she still kept a small box of her belongings, a time capsule of her childhood memories. Photos, letters, small trinkets that reminded her of her mother's kindness. Was that what she meant? Had something happened to those memories? The thought made his chest tighten. He pressed harder on the accelerator. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. He turned onto the highway, his car cutting through the rain like a silver shadow. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, but his mind drifted to the past, to the time when Sandra had helped him without saying a word. Years ago, when he had been struggling silently with grief, she had noticed. She never asked questions or offered empty comfort. Instead, she left small notes on set, simple messages like, "You matter," and "Take one breath at a time." He never forgot that kindness. Now it was his turn. The road stretched endlessly before him, dark and lonely. He drove for hours, the rain never stopping. Sometimes he could barely see the road, but he kept going. Every few minutes, he checked his phone, hoping for a message or a call from her. There was nothing. As he crossed the city limits, a flood warning flashed on the roadside sign. He ignored it. He had faced worse storms before, on screen and in life. Nothing could stop him tonight. At one point, his car splashed through a flooded patch, jerking slightly. He slowed down, his breath steady but eyes sharp. The world around him was a blur of rain and headlights, but his focus never broke. Somewhere far away, Sandra was crying alone, and that thought fueled him like fire. By the time he reached the countryside highway, dawn was still hours away. The rain had softened to a whisper and fog rolled over the hills. Keanu's headlights cut through it as he drove deeper into the quiet. Rural roads that led to her house. Memories of their friendship filled his mind. The laughter, the shared silences, the moments between scenes where they talked about life, loss, and how kindness could heal anything. She had always been the one with strength in her smile, the one who carried light even when she was hurting. To hear her voice broken like that felt wrong. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone, surrounded by the ashes of her past. As he neared her town, the storm clouds broke apart slightly, revealing faint stars. The sound of his tires against the wet road seemed to echo louder in the quiet. He finally turned into the small dirt path leading to her old farmhouse. The gate creaked when he pushed it open, and the smell of burnt wood reached him before he even saw the house. His heart sank. From a distance, he could see faint smoke curling up from the roof and the faint orange glow of something that had burned through the night. He parked quickly and ran toward the house, shouting her name. "Sandra! Are you here?" No answer, only the soft crackling of what was left of the fire. He stepped inside, his shoes soaking the wet floor. Broken glass shimmered faintly in the dim light. Pieces of old photographs were scattered near the doorway. On the wall, a framed picture had fallen, its glass shattered. Then he saw her. Sandra sat on the floor near the living room window, her hair messy, her eyes swollen from crying. Beside her was a small wooden box, half burnt, half soaked. She was staring at it like it was a piece of her heart she couldn't let go of. Keanu approached quietly. "Sandra?" She looked up slowly, her eyes filled with tears but also disbelief. "You came. You called," he said softly. "Of course I did." She looked back at the box, her voice trembling. The lightning hit the side of the house. Everything burned. These were my mother's letters, her photos, everything I had left of her. He crouched beside her, his heart breaking at the sight. She picked up a burnt letter. The ink melted into blurred patterns. "She used to write me stories about hope, about not giving up even when life hurts. And now even her words are gone." Keanu didn't speak. Instead, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned slightly against him, her breathing uneven. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the rain tapping against the broken windows. The smell of wet ashes filled the air, but somewhere inside the heaviness, there was a quiet comfort. He finally spoke. "We'll find a way, Sandra. Maybe not to replace it, but to remember it." She shook her head softly. "How do you rebuild something that's gone forever?" He looked at the charred box, then at her. "Sometimes you start with one piece. Even one small piece can bring back the whole story." She closed her eyes, her tears falling freely now. "It's all just ashes, Keanu." "It's all gone." He didn't reply. Instead, he reached down and began carefully picking up small fragments of paper, laying them gently on a dry cloth nearby. She watched him silently, her lips trembling. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Starting with one piece," he said softly. The night stretched into morning, and as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Keanu was still there, quietly collecting the remains of her memories. His hands were blackened with soot, but his eyes were calm. He didn't speak much, but his presence said everything. He wasn't going to leave her alone in this loss. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not pity. Just a deep understanding that kindness was the only light strong enough to break grief. Sandra watched him as he worked, her heart softening. She realized that sometimes comfort didn't come from words, but from the quiet act of someone showing up when the world falls apart. "When the sun finally rose," she whispered. "Thank you for coming." He smiled faintly. "I told you once kindness doesn't ask for an invitation." She nodded, tears glistening again. But this time they weren't just from sadness. As light filled the room, the ashes seemed to fade into gold. It was still broken, but not empty anymore. That was the first time in years she believed that maybe loss could still lead to something beautiful. The morning after the fire was quiet, the kind of silence that follows heartbreak. Soft light filtered through the damaged curtains, falling over the small wooden box that held what was left of Sandra's memories. Keanu sat near the window, still in the same clothes from the night before, his eyes fixed on the faint smoke rising from the blackened garden outside. Sandra moved slowly around the room, trying to collect what little survived the fire. Her hands trembled every time she picked up a burnt letter or a broken frame. Keanu didn't say much. He knew there were no words that could fix this kind of pain. Instead, he helped quietly, sorting through pieces of her past, brushing off soot and ash as if handling fragile glass. The air smelled of rain and burnt paper. Every corner of the house carried a story that could never be told again. After some time, Sandra sat down near the table, staring at the box. "You didn't have to come all this way," she whispered. Keanu looked at her softly. "You called." "I couldn't just stay," she smiled faintly, but her eyes were red from crying. I didn't even think you'd answer. I didn't know who else to call. He leaned forward slightly. You didn't have to think. Sometimes hearts just know where to go. His voice was calm but carried weight. It made her blink away new tears. She nodded and looked back at the mess around them. She used to keep everything so perfectly, she said. Every letter, every old photo, every memory. She said memories are proof that love survives time. Keanu's eyes drifted toward a small piece of paper stuck to the edge of the burnt box. He picked it up carefully. The ink had faded almost completely, but one word was still clear. Hope. He placed it on the table gently. Maybe she was right, he said softly. This one word survived everything. Sandra stared at it for a long time. Her lips trembled, but a small light returned to her eyes. Maybe, she whispered. Maybe she wanted it to. They sat there for hours talking in quiet voices. She told him stories of her mother, how she used to sit by the window and write letters to her future self, how she always said that even pain could be a teacher if you listened closely. Keanu listened without interrupting, his heart heavy but calm. Every word she spoke seemed to draw him closer into her world of grief and love. As afternoon turned to evening, he looked at her and said, You know, sometimes memories hide in more places than we think. Maybe not all of them burned. She looked confused. What do you mean? He stood up slowly. Let me drive into town. Maybe there's something left in your mother's old library or the school she taught at. Places like that remember people? Sandra frowned. Keanu, that was years ago, and the town's library burned down long before. There's nothing left there. He smiled slightly, a calm but determined smile. Then maybe there's someone who remembers her. Before she could stop him, he picked up his jacket. Stay here. Rest a little. I'll come back. She hesitated, her voice small. Keanu, you've already done enough. You don't have to. He turned back and looked at her, his eyes steady. Yes, I do. Because once you did the same for me, her breath caught. She remembered that time. Years ago, when he had lost someone he loved deeply, she had found him sitting alone on a studio bench. She didn't say much then either. She just sat beside him for hours, letting silence do the healing. He had never forgotten that. Now he was giving that same silence back to her, only this time it was filled with action, not words. The sound of his car starting broke the still air outside. Sandra watched from the window as he drove away, the road stretching out like a gray ribbon beneath the soft rain. As he drove through the countryside, Keanu felt the strange stillness that comes when the world slows down. The road was almost empty. Trees lined both sides, their branches bending slightly under the weight of the rain. The sky was silver, heavy with clouds, yet it felt peaceful. He thought about how many times kindness had guided his life, how strangers had helped him when no one had to, how small acts had changed his path forever. He remembered once saying in an interview that grief and love are two sides of the same coin, and that kindness is what keeps it spinning. Now, as he drove toward Sandra's childhood town, those words felt alive again. When he arrived, the streets looked quiet, almost frozen in time. Small houses with faded paint stood along narrow roads. He parked near the old post office, the one Sandra had once mentioned her mother used to visit every week. He walked in, the bell over the door ringing softly. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, sorting envelopes. She looked up and smiled faintly. Hello there. Can I help you? She asked. Keanu nodded politely. I'm looking for something. Or maybe someone who remembers Mary Bullock. The woman's hands froze. Mary Bullock, she repeated. The teacher? He smiled. Yes, she was Sandra's mother. The woman's eyes softened instantly. Oh, dear Mary. Everyone here remembers her. She taught half the children in this town how to read. I still have one of her letters somewhere. Keanu's heart lifted slightly. You do? The woman nodded and began searching through a drawer filled with old envelopes and papers. After a moment, she pulled out a faded yellow letter. She used to write little thank-you notes for everyone who helped her with the school books. I kept mine. Keanu took it gently. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the writing was still visible. At the bottom of the page, one line stood out. If ever my daughter is in pain, May kindness find her. His breath caught. The same words Sandra had repeated last night when she said her mother's words were gone. The woman noticed his reaction. She said that a lot, she added with a soft smile. Mary believed that kindness travels. She said even when we leave this world, our kindness keeps walking. Keanu's eyes softened. He thanked the woman and asked if he could take the letter. She nodded gladly. For her daughter? Of course. As he walked back to his car, he held the letter carefully like something sacred. Rain began again, gentle this time, washing the streets in a calm glow. He sat in the car for a moment, reading the line again and again. May kindness find her, he whispered to himself. It already did. He started the engine and began driving toward the old school where Mary Bullock had taught. The building was half ruined, its walls covered in vines. But inside, he found a small shelf untouched by time. There were old attendance sheets, student essays, and a few photographs of school events. In one of the photos, Mary stood beside a young man holding a box of books. The man's face looked strangely familiar. His eyes, his smile. Something about him stirred a memory deep within Keanu. He leaned closer, his hands tightening around the frame. The man looked like his father. He froze, unable to move. For a moment, he wondered if it was possible. His father had traveled across many towns during his younger years, volunteering at schools and libraries before his life had changed. Could it be true? Could this connection go back generations? The realization hit him like a soft wave. The kindness that had once touched his father's life might have reached Sandra's family too. He took the photo and placed it beside the letter. His heart was racing now, not from fear, but from the quiet shock of fate. This wasn't just about helping a friend anymore. It was about completing a circle that had started long before either of them knew. As he drove back through the rain, the roads shimmered under the headlights. The world felt strangely peaceful, as if everything was happening exactly as it was meant to. The letter beside him fluttered gently in the breeze from the window. It was as though her mother's words were guiding him home. When he finally saw Sandra's house in the distance, he slowed down, his heart full of emotion. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow through the mist. He parked the car quietly and looked at the photo once more. The faces in it seemed to smile back at him, connected by something far beyond coincidence. He took a deep breath and whispered softly, "Your kindness never ended, Mary. It just changed hands." The rain stopped completely. As he stepped out of the car, he was ready to tell Sandra what he had found. But what he didn't know yet was that the truth he carried would change everything between them forever. When Keanu knocked softly on the door, Sandra was still sitting near the old wooden box. Her eyes were tired, but she managed a small smile when she saw him standing there again, wet from the rain and holding something close to his chest. "You came back," she said, her voice soft. He nodded gently. "I told you I would." He stepped inside and placed the objects on the table, a faded photograph and a yellowed letter sealed in a small plastic sheet. Sandra stared at them, confused. "What is this?" she asked quietly. He sat across from her, his eyes calm but full of emotion. "Something that survived. Something your mother left behind." She blinked in disbelief, her fingers trembling as she reached for the letter. She opened it carefully, afraid it might fall apart. Her eyes moved slowly over the familiar handwriting. "This is her writing," she whispered, her voice shaking. "How did you find this?" Keanu leaned back slightly, his tone steady. The woman at the post office remembered her. "She said your mother used to write letters to thank people who helped her. This one was still kept safely." Sandra read the letter silently. It spoke of hope, of believing in the goodness of strangers. And at the end was the same line that had haunted her memory for years. "If ever my daughter is in pain, may kindness find her." She pressed the letter against her heart, tears falling freely. "She used to say this to me when I was little. I thought those words were gone forever." Keanu smiled softly. "They found their way back to you." For a long moment, the only sound was the soft patter of rain outside. Then Sandra looked at the photograph lying beside the letter. She froze. In the picture, her mother stood smiling beside a young man holding a wooden box of books. His posture, His eyes, even the curve of his smile, looked strangely familiar. "Who is he?" she asked, confused. Keanu looked at the photograph with quiet disbelief. "That's what I came to tell you." He took a breath. "The man in that picture looks exactly like my father." Sandra's eyes widened. "Your father?" He nodded slowly. "He used to travel a lot when he was younger. He helped schools rebuild libraries and gave away books to children who couldn't afford them. I never understood why he did it, but he once told me a teacher inspired him, a woman who told him that kindness should never have a name. Her name was Mary." Sandra's breath caught. "My mother's name was Mary Bullock." The room went silent. Neither spoke for a long time. The air felt heavy, filled with the kind of stillness that happens when two lives realize they've been connected long before they met. She finally whispered, "So your father and my mother, they knew each other?" "I think they did," he said softly. "The woman at the post office said your mother used to thank a man who donated books for the school's reopening after the flood. That man was named Samuel Reeves. That was my father." Sandra's hands covered her mouth, her eyes filling again. "This can't be real." Keanu nodded. "It's real. Your mother's kindness changed my father's life. And maybe that's why he taught me to always help people without expecting anything in return," he said once. "If you can't repay kindness, pass it forward." Her tears flowed again, but this time they carried warmth, not pain. "So when I called you last night, when I said I had nothing left, you came because—" He looked at her, his voice low and sincere. "Because kindness already connected us long before that call. I just didn't know it yet." Sandra covered her face for a moment, trying to take in everything. She could feel her mother's presence in the room, as if her spirit had quietly guided Keanu to her doorstep. After a long pause, she looked up and smiled faintly. "You know, my mother used to believe that kindness never disappears. She said it travels from one heart to another until it finds where it belongs. I guess she was right." Keanu nodded, his eyes glistening. "She was more than right." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky that was slowly turning clear. Sunlight began breaking through the clouds, painting the wet fields with a golden glow. "She wanted you to have this peace," he said quietly. "And now, through all of this, she gave it back." Sandra joined him by the window. The air outside was fresh after the storm. She could see small birds flying between the trees, their wings glistening under the new light. For the first time in days, she smiled naturally. "You drove all this way?" she said softly. "You went through the storm, through flooded roads, through everything just to bring me this?" He shrugged lightly. It wasn't the storm that mattered. It was the promise. What promise? He looked at her with calm eyes. To never let a kind person face darkness alone. She looked at him quietly, her heart heavy with gratitude. She had known Keanu for years, but in this moment, she saw him differently. Not as a famous actor, not as a friend, but as someone carrying the same belief her mother had lived by. She whispered, "You remind me of her." He smiled gently. "Maybe that's because your mother reminded mine too." A soft laugh escaped her lips, breaking the emotional weight of the moment. "You think they'd be proud of us?" He nodded slowly. "I think they already are." They sat by the window for a long time, watching sunlight slowly dry the rain from the earth. Keanu placed the photograph on the table beside the burnt box. The ashes no longer looked like remnants of loss. They looked like soil ready for something new to grow. After a few minutes, Sandra said quietly, "There's something else I never told you." Keanu turned to her. "What is it?" She hesitated before speaking. "The night before my mother passed away, she made me promise one thing," she said. "When you find the person who reminds you of peace, never let them walk alone." He looked at her, surprised by the timing of those words. "She really said that?" She nodded. "And last night when I called you, I didn't call because I needed help. I called because your voice was the only thing that felt like peace." His chest tightened slightly. He didn't know what to say. So he did what he always did when words weren't enough. He simply smiled quietly. For a long time, they both stood in silence. But this time, it was not the silence of pain. It was the silence of two hearts understanding something words couldn't describe. As the sun climbed higher, the world outside shimmered with new life. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distant street, and the air smelled of fresh rain and blooming grass. Keanu looked out one last time before turning back to her. "Let's rebuild what you lost," he said softly. She blinked. "How?" "We'll go back to your old town," he said, a hint of determination in his voice. "The library, the school, the places your mother touched, they still hold her story. We'll gather it all, piece by piece." Sandra hesitated. "You'd really do that?" He nodded without doubt. "We both owe her that much." She smiled through her tears, and for the first time since the fire, hope returned to her face. "Then let's do it. Let's find every piece she left behind." Keanu reached for his keys again, and together they stepped out into the morning light. The road ahead was long, but neither of them felt lost anymore. Some journeys begin with a plan. Others begin with a call. This one began with kindness. The next morning was calm and bright. The sky washed clean after the storm. Keanu and Sandra packed a small bag with notebooks, gloves, and a few envelopes to protect anything they might find. As they stepped outside, the air smelled of wet soil and sunlight. Sandra looked at the road stretching ahead. "I haven't been back to that town since she passed," she said softly. Keanu gave a gentle smile. "Then let's go together. Maybe the past is waiting to be remembered." They drove quietly through narrow country roads, passing green fields and quiet villages. Sandra's eyes often filled with emotion as familiar places passed by. She pointed toward a bridge. "My mother used to walk me across that every morning for school," she whispered. Keanu nodded, listening with care. Every memory she shared seemed to build a map of love and loss. He could almost feel her mother's presence in each turn of the road. When they reached the old school, the building looked worn but still alive. Ivy covered the walls, and faint laughter echoed from nearby children playing under the trees. Sandra stopped near the gate, her eyes wide. "It's still standing," she said. They entered the old classroom where Mary Bullock had once taught. The desks were dusty, but her handwriting was still faintly visible on the chalkboard. Sandra traced the letters gently. She used to write messages for her students every Friday. "She said learning kindness was more important than learning grammar." Keanu smiled. Sounds like something she'd still say. As they looked around, an old caretaker approached them slowly. "You must be Mary's daughter," he said kindly. "She changed this place forever." He handed Sandra a small metal box. "Your mother asked me to give this to you someday. She said someone kind would bring you back." Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were small items: a pressed flower, a torn note, and a folded picture of young children reading under sunlight. Written on the back were words that made her eyes fill instantly. "To whoever carries kindness forward, you are part of my story now." She looked at Keanu, her lips trembling. "She meant you." He shook his head humbly. "No, she meant everyone who chooses kindness. We're just lucky to be the next ones." They stood quietly, the golden light falling across the classroom. The air was still, filled with something sacred. Sandra whispered, "She left pieces of her heart everywhere." Keanu nodded gently. "And maybe that's what real love does. It never disappears, it just finds new hands to hold it." As they stepped back outside, the children waved from under the trees. One of them ran up and handed Sandra a small wildflower. She smiled, holding it close. The world felt lighter again, like the burden of loss had turned into a bridge of memories. Their journey wasn't over yet, but both knew now it was no longer about searching for what was lost. It was about finding how kindness continues to live. The sun was beginning to set as Keanu and Sandra reached the small church at the edge of town. It was quiet and surrounded by tall trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. The bell above the door was cracked, and ivy crept along the walls, but the place still carried a peaceful warmth. Sandra looked up at the old wooden cross above the entrance. "She used to bring me here every Sunday," she whispered. "She said this place reminded her that faith and kindness are the same thing." Keanu smiled softly. "Maybe that's why it's still standing." They stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through colored glass, painting the walls in gentle shades of blue and gold. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars. At the front pew sat an old priest, his hands folded in prayer. When he saw them, he smiled kindly. "You must be Mary's daughter," he said in a soft, warm voice. Sandra nodded, her throat tight. "You knew her?" "Everyone who came here knew her," the priest said, his eyes distant with memory. "She once donated her only gold pendant to help repair the roof. When I asked her why, she said, 'Kindness is not what we give from extra. It's what we give from love.'" Tears glistened in Sandra's eyes again. "That sounds like her." The priest looked at Keanu and smiled gently. "And you must be the one she spoke about?" Keanu frowned slightly. "Me?" The priest nodded. "Years ago, she asked me to keep something safe. She said one day a kind soul would bring her daughter home again, and when that happens, I should give this to him." He stood and walked to a small wooden cabinet near the altar. From inside, he took out a sealed envelope wrapped with a faded red ribbon. He handed it carefully to Keanu. Keanu accepted it with both hands, his heart racing slightly. The paper was old but perfectly preserved. On the front, written in delicate handwriting, were the words to the one who travels through storms for love. "Thank you." Sandra looked at it, her lips trembling. "Open it," she whispered. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the letter. It was short, written with gentle strokes that seemed to breathe with warmth. "Dear kind stranger, if you ever find your way to my daughter, tell her that love never truly leaves. It changes its shape and becomes the kindness that saves us when the world breaks. You are the proof of that. You were sent not by chance, but by the circle that kindness always completes." At the bottom, her mother had signed her name, Mary Bullock. Sandra covered her face, sobbing quietly. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "She wrote this years before I even knew you," he said gently. "She somehow knew someone would come for you." The priest nodded slowly. "Mary always said kindness has memory. It remembers who needs it next." For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of wind outside mixed with the soft rustle of leaves against the windows. The air felt full of presence, like Mary herself was there with them, smiling from somewhere unseen. Keanu folded the letter again and handed it to Sandra. "It belongs to you," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, it belongs to both of us. You were part of her message." He looked down, humbled. "I just did what anyone would do." She smiled faintly through her tears. "No, not anyone. Only someone who understands that kindness is a responsibility, not an act." As they walked out of the church, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft orange glow across the fields. Fireflies began to appear one by one, lighting the path back to their car. Sandra held the letter close to her heart. "She was right," she said quietly. "Kindness does travel." Keanu looked at the fading light ahead, and it found its way home. The road back was silent, but it was the kind of silence filled with peace. For the first time, Sandra didn't feel the ache of loss pressing on her chest. She felt warmth instead, like her mother was walking beside her, proud and calm. As they reached the gate of her farmhouse, Sandra stopped and looked at Keanu. "There's something I want to do," she said softly. He tilted his head. "What is it?" She smiled gently. "I want to rebuild her time capsule. Not to replace the past, but to add to it. This time it will hold stories of everyone her kindness reached." Keanu's eyes softened. "Then let's start tonight." Together they carried a small wooden box inside, placed the letters, the photograph, and a few wildflowers from the schoolyard inside it. Sandra lit a candle and whispered softly, "For every act of kindness that began with her." Keanu looked at the flickering flame. "And for every act that will follow." The candlelight danced between them, warm and steady, as though the past and the present had finally met in peace. The next morning began with a quiet glow. Sunlight poured gently into the farmhouse through half-broken windows, resting over the small wooden box that now held all the pieces they had gathered. Sandra woke early, the faint smell of dew drifting in through the curtains. Keanu sat outside on the porch, sipping coffee, his eyes lost in the soft horizon. She joined him silently, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The world around them was peaceful, as if the storm and the fire had never happened. The air carried a calm that felt almost sacred. "Did you sleep?" he asked softly. She smiled faintly. "A little." But it wasn't the sleep that mattered. It was the peace. He nodded, understanding her meaning. For a while, they just sat there, watching birds flutter through the morning light. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was gentle, like a shared heartbeat. After some time, Sandra looked at him with thoughtful eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about how kindness travels." Keanu looked at her quietly. "What about it?" She smiled softly. Maybe that's what this was all about. Not loss, not pain, not even memories. Maybe this was kindness coming full circle. He turned his gaze toward the open field. "Your mother started something beautiful. She showed kindness to a man who later taught his son the same lesson. And that son drove through a storm to return it." Her voice trembled slightly. "And because of that, I'm not broken anymore. I'm grateful." A soft wind passed through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and blooming flowers. It felt like nature itself was nodding in agreement. They spent the morning rebuilding small corners of the house, cleaning the ash-stained floor, fixing the fallen frames, and planting flowers in the garden. Each act felt like a quiet tribute to Mary Bullock's legacy. When they finally placed the restored time capsule on the shelf, Sandra added one last thing. A new letter she had written that morning. She handed it to Keanu. "Read it." He opened it carefully. The letter was short, but every word carried deep emotion. "Dear Mother, I lost you once, but I found you again in every act of kindness that touched my life. Your wish came true. Kindness found me, and it came with your name written on its heart. Love, your daughter." Keanu folded the letter gently and placed it in the box. "She'd be proud," he said quietly. Sandra smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "She'd be thankful. She always believed people like you keep her kind of hope alive." He shook his head humbly. "I just did what anyone with a heart should do." She looked at him with deep gratitude. "No, Keanu. Most people wait for the storm to pass before helping. You drove through it." He smiled softly, but his eyes glistened too. "Maybe because sometimes we need to be the light we wish someone else had been for us." They stood together in the quiet room, surrounded by sunlight and soft shadows. There was no grand music, no applause, just the still peace of knowing something good had been restored. Later that afternoon, they took a drive back toward the town. The roads were dry now, the fields glowing under the golden sun. They stopped by the school one last time. Children were playing outside, their laughter bright and free. Sandra walked to the notice board and pinned a small note written in simple words. "In memory of Mary Bullock, the woman who taught that kindness never dies." She stepped back and watched as a few students gathered to read it. One little girl smiled and turned to her friend, saying, "Then we should be kind too." That single sentence made Sandra's eyes well up. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "That's how her story lives forever." As they drove back, the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of gold and rose. Sandra rested her head against the window, the letter from her mother resting on her lap. "You know," she said softly, "when I called you that night, I thought I was calling for help, but now I know I was calling home." Keanu glanced at her with a gentle smile, and kindness answered. They both laughed softly, the sound warm and unforced. The road ahead glowed with the last light of evening, long and peaceful. By the time they reached her house, the stars were appearing one by one. Keanu parked the car and looked up at the sky. "She's probably watching," he said quietly. Sandra followed his gaze. "And smiling, because we finally understood her lesson." Keanu nodded. "That kindness doesn't end with the people we love. It keeps moving through the people they touched." A comfortable silence filled the air again. Sandra whispered, "Thank you for finding me when I couldn't find myself." He looked at her with soft eyes. "You don't need to thank me. This is what friends do. They remind each other where the light is." She smiled, a calm and genuine smile that reached her eyes. As he prepared to leave, she stopped him at the door. "One last thing," she said, handing him a small folded paper. He opened it. It was a copy of her mother's line written in her handwriting. "If ever my daughter is in pain, may kindness find her." Underneath it, Sandra had added one more sentence. "And if kindness ever feels lost, may it remember the road that leads home." Keanu read it slowly, then looked up with emotion in his eyes. "This belongs to both of us now," he said quietly. She nodded. "Yes." "It does." He smiled, turned to leave, and paused for a moment at the gate. The wind blew softly, carrying the faint scent of roses and rain. As his car disappeared down the road, Sandra stood there in the fading light, holding the note close to her heart. She whispered to the sky, "Thank you, Mom. Kindness found me." And somewhere above the clouds, it felt as though a gentle voice answered back. Carried by the wind, it always will. The story ends not with goodbye, but with a beginning, the beginning of a kindness that would keep traveling, from one heart to another, forever finding its way home.